We were merely feeding ducks when the war began. I was sitting with my wife Natasha at the end of our decrepit dock, toes dipping into the lake, hands clasped together like two souls who'd finally left behind the world's din. The sun was gentle, ducks were quacking, and for the first time in years, there seemed to be peace. And then came the sound of heels clicking. Crystal Fairmont, HOA compliance queen of Pine Ridge Lake, stomped down our driveway like a parade dictator, clipboard in one fist, power trip in the other. If you've ever encountered an HOA Karen, you understand me. This wasn't a matter of bird feeders or paint color. This was war covered up in paperwork, and I had no idea that 3 weeks later she'd be being dragged off in cuffs. Her HOA empire toppled, and my sweet, gentle wife, the Lady Crystal, ridiculed as a helpless housewife, be the mastermind behind it all. Where are you sitting to watch this go down? Leave your location in the comments, because you're about to see how an afternoon of feeding ducks turned into a federal sting. Let me tell you how it started. I'm Troy Davidson, 45. A former park ranger with a back condition and a cabin my wife and I purchased as our retirement home in rural Wisconsin. We weren't flashy. Our cabin was shabby but lovely in its own way. Wildflowers Natasha planted that flowered each spring, weathered Adirondack chairs looking out over the lake, quiet, authentic. Natasha retired from fraud investigation after burning out, or so I believed. She said she wanted peace, to wind down and write a book. She spent days in a sweatshirt and slippers, drinking tea while gazing at her computer. I believed she was recovering. What I didn't realize was, my wife was scheming. Crystal Fairmont was the HOA's golden queen. She resided in a mini-mansion, boasted the devotion of the other half of the town, and paraded like royalty upon a suburban throne. Having approached our porch the first time with no sooner a hello, I should have suspected that something wasn't right. She recited in fractions as if reading from a war document. Dock 3 inches beyond its permissive length. Would finish 2 colors, too dark. Wildflowers, in danger of attracting hazardous pollinators. Bird feeders, encouraging rogue wildlife. And then the patronization. To be honest, Mr. Davidson, your house doesn't project the sophistication we aim for. Then to Natasha, maybe it's best if adults take care of this conversation. I expected Natasha to snap. Instead, she smiled and responded sweetly. Oh, absolutely. Could I maybe take a look at the budget forms, just to learn how this all works? Crystal practically purred with satisfaction, handed her documents, and sashayed off thinking she had tamed us. But she hadn't tamed us. She'd just handed Natasha the rope she would hang her with. I discovered Natasha up at 2 a.m. that night, radiant in the glow of her laptop, surrounded by paperwork. Her eyes were shining, concentrated, watchful, ablaze. What are you doing? I breathed. She didn't even glance up. Troy Crystal made a mistake granting me these documents. She indicated a $30,000 landscaping bill payable to Lakeside Innovations, LLC, a business Crystal's deceased husband supposedly owned. Yes, deceased. Dead men don't deposit checks. It wasn't a single company. It was 3, all fraudulent, all charging the HOA for work not done, and all connected back to Crystal. She wasn't a controlling Karen who micromanaged. She was an embezzler, who was operating a paper empire of shell companies, falsifying invoices and diverting community funds into her own coffers. The following morning we got a fat envelope, 47 violations, $12,000 worth of fines. Our crime, feeding ducks, having the wrong color of wood stain, having chairs that didn't measure up to aesthetic harmony. It was psychological warfare masquerading as legalese. But Natasha didn't budge. She taped the documents out on our kitchen like a crime board and set to work constructing her case the sort of airtight fraud file that would make any prosecutor tremble. Next was Crystal's Community Safety Forum, a town hall masquerading as public shaming. Her silver-haired weasel boyfriend Preston, the lawyer, sat at her side, spilling legal threats like small talk. But Natasha was prepared. She pretended to be dumb. I was just wondering. $30,000 to Lakeside Innovations this year. That sounds expensive for landscaping, doesn't it? The room came to a halt. Preston's smirk broke, and from that moment, the clock on Crystal's empire started ticking. Later, old Dottie, the former HOA treasurer, slipped Natasha a folder. I kept copies. I never trusted her. Inside, 3 years of HOA financials, Crystal's skeletons. What we didn't know was Crystal was watching us literally. She installed cameras aimed at our cabin. She isolated us. Neighbors stopped talking. Bob Henderson started a petition to remove us. It was textbook authoritarianism, HOA style. Then, the fines increased to $20,000. Preston issued threats of foreclosure by mail, and then I returned home to find him in our house, stating an emergency inspection because our dangerous bird feeder was a hazard. He delivered me a restraining order. Natasha was prohibited from attending HOA meetings. That evening I was willing to capitulate, but Natasha, she had just begun. I've taken down CEOs. Crystal isn't smart, she's just arrogant. She'd traced payments, copied contracts, constructed a wire and mail fraud case with federal ramifications. And the next day, she phoned the FBI. Agent Martinez showed up days later, impressed by Natasha's documentation. "This gives us jurisdiction," he said. The FBI froze Crystal's accounts and started questioning residents. Crystal panicked. She burned papers in her backyard. Neighbors reported the smoke. She canvassed door to door, informing all that we were the issue, and then Preston pulled out his lowest trick. Agent Martinez phoned back. "We're suspending the investigation. We've gotten complaints raising doubts about your wife's credibility." Preston fabricated documents claiming Natasha had made false accusations on her previous job, entirely untrue, but it was effective. Neighbors defected. The clubhouse was partying in celebration of Crystal's vindication. I stood at the window and watched as they cheered her with sparkling cider, and Natasha, for the first time, looked broken, her career, herself shattered by lies. But I wasn't going to let her end like that. I had never seen my wife defeated before, not when she buried her father, not when she left a 15-year career in forensic accounting. But that evening, while our neighbors celebrated Crystal's vindication, Natasha said nothing. She remained on the dock, her eyes glazed, clutching her FBI folder as if it were a lifeline. She did not weep. That I knew the depth of the wound. "They stole my name, Troy," she finally whispered. "Not the case, my name." I sat down next to her, at a loss for words. My husband's instincts were to hug her, to tell her it would be all right, but that would have been a lie. We were dealing with a woman of deep pockets, legal contacts, and no conscience. Preston had buried us in lies that even federal agents were taking time to unravel. But Natasha didn't stay on the ground. Long by morning, she was working at her laptop. I built my reputation on facts. I'll rebuild it the same way. She'd already requested public records from her old firm, drafted rebuttals to every false claim Preston had made, and tracked metadata on the forged PDFs he'd submitted to the FBI. His mistakes? He forgot that my wife's specialty wasn't just catching criminals, it was proving how they lied. He used the wrong version of the firm's logo on a document dated 2019. That version didn't exist until 2021, she said, eyes blazing. And this witness statement, it quotes a manager who was terminated for harassment 6 years ago. Idiot. That same afternoon, she sent a 24-page rebuttal directly to Agent Martinez, complete with timestamps, corporate email headers, and digital forensics breakdowns that shredded Preston's fabrications into confetti. By Friday, Martinez called us again. "Mrs. Davidson," he said, "I apologize for the pause. We've reviewed the material. Your documentation is airtight. And Mr. Wickham has just earned himself a second federal case, obstruction of justice." I promise Natasha didn't even crack a smile. She just shut down her laptop and said, "Good, let's get this done." The second domino also fell quickly. Crystal's boyfriend Preston, the self-satisfied legal puppeteer, was suddenly evading subpoenas and acting like his company had no comment. The local newspaper ran a short story about the investigation, and that proved sufficient to produce the first genuine ripple of change in the community. Bob Henderson, he ceased waving his petition clipboard and began whispering behind Crystal's back. The same neighbors who'd celebrated her win were now texting us, just checking in. Didn't know all the facts. Too bad. Natasha was already on board with 2 former HOA board members who'd been gently nudged out by Crystal years before. They'd each kept records, names, vendor grievances, even a blind tip from a landscaper who'd been hired $800 for work. Crystal had charged the HOA $11,000. I thought it was strange, the guy claimed on his voicemail, but she told me it was for a community beautification fund. Natasha sent that voicemail directly to Agent Martinez. And that's when the fuse really ignited. At 6:17 a.m., on a drizzly Tuesday morning, 3 black SUVs stopped in front of Crystal Fairmont's estate. I stood behind our bedroom curtain, observing as FBI agents, accompanied by local police, stormed the estate. One headed directly for the garage, either searching for paper trails or burner drives. Another led Crystal down the driveway in handcuffs, barefoot, still wearing her silk bathrobe. Neighbors came out like prairie dogs, holding coffee cups, mouths agape. The Queen of Pine Ridge Lake was no longer giving a lecture on compliance. She was having her rights read to her. I did not cheer. I did not gloat. I glanced over at Natasha, who still stood at the window, arms crossed, face inscrutable. "They're not finished yet," she said. "Preston's next." Within the hour, Preston's law office was raided. His computers were confiscated, and he was taken away in front of a dozen reporters who had suddenly determined our snoozy HOA war was newsworthy. The headlines rolled in quickly. HOA president and lawyer busted in $89,000 fraud ring phony businesses. Actual crimes. FBI cracks, suburban embezzlement case, housewife turned whistleblower spins federal bust. They referred to Natasha as a housewife. That tickled her funny bone. That evening neighbors delivered pie. Yes, pie. Even Bob Henderson arrived with a half apology and a bought cheesecake. "Guess I was wrong about y'all," he grumbled. "We didn't need their pie, but we took in their shame." Crystal's mugshot hit the evening news in 3 states. Dressed in a rumpled cream robe and mascara smeared on her face, she resembled less of a terrifying HOA queen and more like an intimidated suburban grifter, which, it turned out, she was. The FBI affidavit brought 4 charges of wire fraud, 2 conspiracy charges, and a potential civil forfeiture claim against all the properties and goods acquired via the scam. Her lawyer attempted to spin it. Her job was just monitoring operations, not participating in embezzlement themselves. But Agent Martinez's forensic audit, constructed primarily from Natasha's statistics, confirmed that Crystal had established 3 shell landscaping businesses and signed each check herself. She'd used HOA money to have a koi pond installed, a $30,000 koi pond. Preston, her alleged boyfriend, fared worse. After the FBI cracked his laptop, they discovered a decade's worth of gray legal work comprising forged court documents, fabricated bills, and offshore wire transfers connected to identical HOA boards throughout the county. Apparently, Pine Ridge Lake wasn't their first rodeo, it was their last. The reaction from the community was nuclear. The residents voted in an emergency to dissolve the whole HOA. Bob Henderson, now publicly embarrassed, stepped down from his position and left a printed apology in our mailbox. "Your wife did something we were too afraid to do. I hope she understands she's a hero." Bob H. and Natasha, she never uttered "I told you so." She simply passed on the apology to Agent Martinez and went back to her garden. 3 weeks afterward, there was a federal restitution fund. Residents would be repaid some of their stolen HOA assessments. The community clubhouse, where Crystal used to primp and preen, was renamed the Davidson Pavilion, a motion that passed unanimously. Even the local television station asked for an interview. Natasha refused. "I didn't do this for a headline," she said to me. "I did it because I won't be intimidated by people who rely on silence." But true closure came in silence one evening. Around dusk, we sat on the same dock where she once the air was peaceful. No court appearances, no phone calls, no subpoenas, just quiet water and far-off crickets. "You saved them," I said. "Not just us. Everyone in the neighborhood." She gazed out over the lake. "They didn't believe me," she said. "But it doesn't matter. I believed myself, and I knew the truth would be louder than their lies." I hugged her close. "They'll never look at a quiet housewife again." She smiled. "Good." The storm struck shortly after midnight. Rain pounded the window panes as Natasha circled the kitchen in silence, watching the front door as if it would open at any moment. But it did not. Her husband Malik was gone. He'd set out that morning to confront Crystal Fairmont, the merciless leader of the HOA board, with the 4th phony violation notice in 2 months. That was 16 hours ago. And now his phone was dead. His car wasn't in the driveway, and no neighbor had spotted him since then. She heard it. A soft tap, but it wasn't on the door. It was from the attic. She reached for a flashlight, her heart racing, and went up the creaking pool downstairs. Every step sounded noisier than the one before. The wind screamed at the back of the walls as if something were alive. At the top of the attic ladder, something tripped her, a metal case. She opened it up and gasped. Inside was a secret camera, one Malik had placed in Crystal's backyard, and next to it was a note in his handwriting. "If anything happens to me, show this to the FBI." 2 months earlier, they had fled to Pine Ridge Lake for peace. After years in the city, Natasha believed a quiet HOA community would be safer, cleaner, normal. But by week 2, they knew something wasn't right. Crystal Fairmont ruled the HOA like a dictatorship. Surveillance, drones, secret meetings. Residents ticketed for grass that grew half an inch higher than acceptable. "She's just maintaining order," Malik said initially. Then the counterfeited fines. $125 for a trash can that was not seen from the curb, $75 for an unapproved color on the mailbox. Natasha documented. Dates, photographs. None of it added up. She's pilfering, Natasha whispered. This is not about regulations. It's about intimidation. The setup: when Malik made his official complaint, he received a call to appear at an HOA hearing. No witness, no tapes. Just Crystal and two condescending board members, Preston and Barbara, badgering him as if he were a suspect. He returned home, shaken. She told me that if I keep harassing her, she'll have me evicted. And she smiled when she told me. That evening, Natasha started searching out Crystal Fairmont the only way she knew how as an ex-fraud analyst. She followed the HOA's landscaper to a P.O. box. She looked up property records. 3 of the houses sold for a loss. All now owned by Crystal's niece. It wasn't an HOA. It was a money laundering ring behind a white picket fence. The vanishing the day Malik disappeared. He left a voicemail Natasha would replay 100 times. Babe, I'm going to get her on camera. Meet me at the dock at 9 if I'm not there. Check the attic. But he never showed. Natasha called the sheriff, but they said he probably just needed space. The neighbors were worse. Crystal says he attacked her, Barbara said with an evil smile. You might want to think twice about defending him. You're on thin ice yourself. That's when Natasha realized they weren't just gaslighting her, they were setting her up. The footage in the attic. Natasha found not just 1 but 5 micro SD cards labeled with dates, all recent. She spent the next 48 hours watching the footage in silence. What she witnessed chilled her blood. Crystal and Preston weren't merely pretending to have HOA infractions. They were orchestrating infractions on other homes, driving in the dead of night to deposit trash, smash fences, steal mailbox flags, then filing actual citations and compelling residents to sell. There was one video where Preston was even in her own backyard, pulling up her garden fence. And then, a final clip, Malik yelling at Crystal in back of her pool house. You can't threaten me into silence, he yelled. Oh honey, Crystal laughed. I don't have to threaten you. You'll comply because nobody here will take you seriously. Anyway, then blackness. The war breaks out. Natasha clammed up. But not for long. She collected it all: dated video evidence, fake notices, fiscal documents. Then she submitted a formal complaint with the state housing agency, the sheriff's department, and lastly the FBI. Crystal had no idea. Natasha smiled as she composed her last email to the agency, attached: proof of fraud, surveillance, theft of property, and possibly foul play in connection with the disappearance of my husband, Malik Davidson. My name is Natasha, and I won't rest until all of them pay for what they've done. 3 nights later, floodlights illuminated the lakefront sky. FBI agents streamed into Crystal's house with a search warrant. Preston bolted out the back gate and was tackled at once on the golf course. Natasha stood in her front yard, silently watching them carry boxes of documents, hard drives, and cameras out of Crystal's mansion. And then Crystal herself showed up barefoot, screaming, handcuffed. You can't do this to me. I'm the president. I am the HOA. But nobody was listening anymore. Epilogue: Malik was discovered in a secluded wooded area 20 miles distant. Alive but drugged. Crystal's staff had enticed him under false conditions and left him unconscious to stage a disappearance. He healed gradually, but he never failed to refer to Natasha as his hero. The HOA was voted out of existence. Crystal and Preston were charged with federal racketeering, fraud, and false imprisonment. And Natasha, she finally dug that garden. The one they'd once slapped her with a $250 fine for. This time, no one so much as opened their mouth. Leave Pine Ridge with nothing but a trash bag, Crystal Fairmont had sneered. Her French manicure tapping against the car window. Natasha had taken it as just another empty threat. But now, barefoot, on her own front lawn, as deputies taped foreclosure signs over her windows, Natasha knew that Crystal had meant every word. Her bank accounts frozen, her utilities cut off, her car booted, her face now plastered across the local news, described as disorderly HOA member charged with trespass, harassment, and vandalism. Except none of it ever happened. She hadn't trespassed at the HOA office. She hadn't sent threatening letters to residents. She hadn't deflated anyone's tires. But Crystal had faked the footage. And now, the HOA queen who used to host bake sales was orchestrating a psychological coup against Natasha, the single woman who had had the temerity to reveal her transgressions. And the worst part, Malik was still recovering, with no recollection of half what occurred the night he disappeared. And Natasha, she was alone, or so she thought, stripped following the raid by the FBI, Crystal was taken into custody but posted bail within 24 hours. The press described it as a misunderstanding. Her attorneys framed it as a smear campaign spearheaded by an upset resident with a grudge. Members of the HOA filled social media with the hashtags #StandWithCrystal and #KeepOurCommunitySafe. Within a week, Natasha's accounts were frozen in suspicion of identity theft and tipped to the bank from an anonymous sender. Then the notices arrived. Non-compliance with HOA regulations, $500 day. Unauthorized construction her garden trellis, $2,000 penalty. Harassment complaints to the community, liable to be forcibly evicted. By week 2, the court had issued her an emergency restraining order, not against Crystal, but against her. The reversal, what Crystal didn't know. Natasha had one last emergency plan. The files weren't on USB drives only. She'd also sent full copies anonymously to 5 locations in 5 states. One of them ended up in the possession of freelance investigative journalist Leah Drummond in Atlanta. Leah's viral report dropped onto YouTube labeled HOAOR, My FIA, The Untold Story of Crystal Mont. Within a week it accumulated 1.7 million views. Natasha's email inbox burst, and there was one message that jumped out. My name is Jenna. I resided in the same HOA 2 years ago. Crystal swiped my home, I've got video, and I want to testify. The gathering individuals, one by one, stepped forward. A widowed father whose home was taken after false fence height infractions. A disabled woman who was fined for noise complaints. She never complained about a husband and wife whose monitoring was erased before they were sued for harassment. They had all been driven by one thing in common. Crystal had attacked them when they pushed back against her authority. And Natasha, she was the first to resist and live. Leah posted a second video, Crystal Fairmont, the faces of her victims. This time, the FBI contacted her. The crackdown equipped with new affidavits, video testimony, and witness statements. The feds made a second push. Crystal was rearrested, this time without bail. Her board pals, Preston and Barbara, were indicted. The HOA's legal practice was shut down. Subpoenas were issued like wildfire, and Natasha, outside the courthouse, no makeup, no attorney, just her voice. This isn't about HOA regulations. This is about power, and what people like Crystal Fairmont do when nobody makes them do anything. The payoff, 6 months later, Crystal entered a guilty plea to wire fraud, racketeering, conspiracy, falsification of public records, and identity theft. She was sent to federal prison for 22 years. The community voted to abolish the HOA and go to a voluntary resident council. Malik, healthy once more, went back to work, albeit this time from far away from Pine Ridge, and Natasha, she didn't accept a settlement. She grabbed the mic. Justice Has a Name, her TED Talk. The Dark Side of Suburbia. How One Woman Fought Back has already been viewed more than 9.4 million times. Netflix made a rights inquiry, and each month, reliably, someone new contacts Natasha's website. You don't know me, but your story saved my life. It took Natasha 6 months after the sentencing of Crystal Fairmont to feel some peace. She had left Pine Ridge, changed her number, launched a podcast titled HOA Hell, smiled again even. Peace doesn't stay. However, when monsters learn your name, Natasha went into her email one morning and stopped cold. Sender Crystal. Subject, it's not over. You think you won. You think prison is the end. I built Pine Ridge, and now I'm building something better. You'll be hearing from my attorney. See the prison network. Crystal wasn't just sitting in a cell. She was organizing. From prison, she began writing letters to her former hate allies, the ones who weren't caught. Her prison commissary was mysteriously loaded every month. A whisper campaign started. Crystal's setting up a clean community coalition. Outside then the bombshell. Crystal filed legal documents to create a new HOA consulting nonprofit operated through a front. The address, a tiny office. In Natasha's new town. The mole at first. Natasha thought it was chance. Then her internet slowed. Then her trash began being knocked over. Then her landlord emailed, "Hi Natasha, a representative from the Community Harmony League visited. They said you've been reported for unapproved renovations to your back patio." Same game, new name, except this time Natasha was ready. She traced the nonprofit's board, found 3 shell companies, found the treasurer Deborah Linhart, a former Pine Ridge resident Natasha never met. But she remembered the name from Crystal's files. Deborah wasn't just a friend, she was Crystal's cousin. This thing Natasha played a favor card. One of her podcast listeners was a Homeland Security cybercrime specialist. In a matter of days, they discovered that the Clean Community Coalition had been donated $180,000 by one anonymous PAC. Bogus addresses, cross-state laundering, IRS indicators, mail fraud, and each document contained one secret: Crystal's handwriting. Natasha set the trap. She impersonated a local city councilwoman who wanted to hire the coalition to reform the zoning. They took the bait. She taped every Zoom session. She taped Deborah boasting about fixing problem tenants. She taped them making bribes. And then she went live. The final exposed Natasha posted her last podcast episode. She's running the HOA from prison. And here's the proof. In 24 hours' time, the prison conducted an internal inquiry. Deborah Linhart was arrested on charges of fraud, conspiracy, and impersonation. The non-profit organization was dismantled. Crystal, she was again charged, this time with RICO charges for engaging in a continuing criminal enterprise. While being held in prison, the judge was enraged. She was moved to a supermax federal prison. All privilege of communication was withdrawn. Her new date of release: life without parole. Full circle. On a quiet afternoon, Natasha returned to Pine Ridge just for one moment. The houses looked the same. The kids rode the same bikes. But the HOA building, empty, windows boarded. The sign cracked and tilted. As she stood by the overgrown community garden, a woman approached. "You're her, aren't you? The one who took her down?" Natasha smiled gently. "No, I'm just someone who would not allow evil to prevail." Never again today. Natasha is the executive director of a national non-profit working for HOA reform. She's testified on Capitol Hill, won an award for journalism, and encouraged state-level legislation protecting homeowners. But the moment she receives an email from a frightened resident, she remembers the gaslighting, the spying, the silence, and she responds in the same manner: "You are not insane, you are not alone, and monsters can be caged."